Good day. My name is Jason Duran. I'm with Adapt Forward and part of the Stall Channels, and I'm very pleased to be addressing the NRC HACK conference. I'll be talking about Cybersecurity Program Support Services today. Ideally, we'll be talking about things that, when done well, contribute to the success of high-performance cyber programs, ideally enhancing the reputation of the organization, but also the industry. A little bit about myself. I like to build teams and solve hard problems. I've got 21 years of cybersecurity professional experience. What I'm most proud of is having built a cybersecurity service provider capability in the Defense Department that recently earned the most commendable services. I recently have been helping the U.S. Navy and the Defense Health Agency defend their commercial cloud environments while continuing to defend their legacy on-premises infrastructure. My specialty is measuring large cybersecurity programs compliance with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. I've earned a Master's of Arts from George Washington University in Computer Fraud Investigations, and I hold a couple of industry certifications in the cybersecurity field. Thank you again for your attention.
And our agenda, we'll be discussing the various components of cybersecurity program support. So that includes governance, continuous improvement, FISMA compliance and oversight, cyber situational awareness, policy standard. Also, I'm going to begin by describing a few things and characteristics that we've observed that are common amongst the highest performing cybersecurity programs. And so peak performance. We've got our background is in helping Department of Defense, federal government, Fortune 500, finance and other industry sectors and educational institutes, each with their own requirements and missions. Our principals have established several highly successful DoD cybersecurity programs. We've also advised and consulted with existing cybersecurity programs to make them better and make improvements. Also, we've helped other defense, intelligence community, counterintelligence, cybersecurity programs prepare for assessments and inspections, each under differing sets of requirements. Most recently are the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And we do this by objectively measuring compliance with the applicable requirements and the different performance specifications. We recommend and help with implementing adjustments and improvements, and also some professional development. We found that the really good programs have certain things in common, and organizationally speaking, they make a very good, solid first impression. Does your program inspire and radiate confidence? This is a nice advantage when you're dealing with regulators, your business partners, your customers, and even your own leadership. There's a specific problem. It comes different names, but it's one that I call the denominator problem, and how to best overcome that. And so one or both of FISMA or a real world adversary is going to make you use or create an inventory of something. It could be the number of VPN devices, number of SolarWinds instances, privileged accounts, file with a specific hash value or a running process, something of the sort, and you'll be put to being and having to calculate a compliance value score. Alternatively, you may find yourself in a race condition to see whether an adversary can compromise something of yours before your network defenders can secure it. And it's not enough just to be able to do these things, but you want to be comfortable and confident in your ability to do so. And so there are ways to structure your program in order to do this, because these types of activities are necessary, they're required. And good programs have figured out ways to do this without a great deal of difficulty. And so I'm going to move on to what the benefits of transparency. And so when asking yourself, are we doing the things that we've set out to do and must be done? Or, are you doing these things well, and how well do you know? Because these are good questions to ask yourself if you're running a cybersecurity program. And so you try to instrument your program such that function-specific performance dashboards are created and available. And so this helps publicly reveal your best performers. These are going to be your leaders and sources of best practices, and also your pool of potential mentors. And so you want to share these best practices internally and externally. And these high performers can be the bedrock upon which a mentor and protege program can be built as either part of a formal and informal part of your larger training program. I've got one last point to make about transparency and being mindful of the current organizational climate. Informally, transparency invites friendly internal competition amongst your staff or recognition as being top performer. And so being able to credit the high performers and making your workforce aware of who they are, there are some intangible benefits associated with that. And so, once you've identified your best performers and you have best practices and you have folks who are, potentially able to serve as mentors, it's good to be a part and participate in members of your community. And so, confidence is infectious, and it enhances your organization's reputation within that community. And so others will seek you out for your counsel, which in turn creates more opportunities to seek and share more best practices. And so this is your community. It includes folks in the energy space, of course, but also other U.S. and foreign government organizations, academia, industry, commercial sectors, as you'd expect. But how well are you being supported by those who provide your threat intelligence? And so we talk about extracting the value from threat intelligence. How much do you know about those who would do you harm? And how does this affect your decision making? The threat climate changes over time, and organizational flexibility to adapt is very necessary. And so an adversary that desires a long-term and persistent presence in your network will move against you differently than an adversary that's financially motivated or seeking to cause disruptions. And so you should be mindful of the different threat sources when making your decisions. And one last point on this slide is if good threat information is hard to acquire, consider investing in your own organic capabilities.
We'll talk about governance, continuous improvement, FISMA Compliance and Oversight, cyber situational awareness, policy, standards, and then training. So we'll begin with governance, which is really the bedrock upon which to build beautiful structures and programs capable of rapidly and accurately determining what a denominator is for compliance-driven questions with a high degree of confidence and precision. Very often, there are information needs about whether and how much of a specific technology or platform are out there, perhaps due to a recent vulnerability being announced or an adversary's exploitation of a recently announced vulnerability. And governance is part of the method by which you're able to very quickly determine how much of what you have, how much of that is exposed as opposed to secured, and how rapidly you're able to know the difference and report your situational awareness upward to your management. This is predicated on your ability to rapidly detect vulnerabilities, but also to conduct analysis to determine and measure the risks associated with the infrastructure and the data that you are charged with. So the bedrock is built upon program and project management. You have to have a solid team of your ability to manage measure, and control your resources, very important. Similarly, you need to be able to manage the vulnerabilities, which have a very temporal nature about them, as there's an ebb and a flow with vulnerabilities, remediation, patching. Risk management is the process by which you take the vulnerabilities with that temporal nature, a sense of the adversarial threat climate, your tolerance for risk measured against your business rules, and how much is enough. How much are you willing to spend in order to manage those vulnerabilities and keep your risk commensurate with your resource level? This is all predicated on having a timely reporting and awareness of the threat environment, threat actors, and those that would do you harm. But also, you need to have a keen sense of what your acquisition strategy is going to be. Do you have the means to acquire the capabilities that you don't have or you don't have quite enough of? Do you have the support of your acquisition core such that you're able to go to market confidently, acquire that which you need, and administer your contracts, manage your industry partners and your government workforce, and have that all come together and work for you at the very end? Next, we're going to talk a little bit about continuous improvement. So this is quantifying whether you have enough or too much of any cybersecurity capability. Do you and can you take a measure of your utilization rates? And what's your overall effectiveness? Generally speaking, you ought to be able to have a sense of whether your cybersecurity program is directionally correct. Are you getting better over time or not? If not, knowing what you can do about it and how to go about fixing it. So that's very important. You'll use tools after some organizational introspection, quality assurance. And what you're looking for is to gain speed, accuracy, precision, and cost improvements over current investments. You want to be able to identify, but then also adopt what are the best practices in the field. You're part of a community defending infrastructure, data, and resources. And so there are cohorts out there. You need to be and practice active listening and try to identify that what's working for others, sharing what works for you with the community, and hopefully participating. You have to have an innate ability to evaluate new, but also retiring outmoded cyber capabilities. You have to be able to take these on as special projects. And so the things that worked for you in the past might not work for you tomorrow. There tends to be a shelf life for any particular technology, any sort of capability. And we need to be mindful of that, take a measure of how well our previous investments are doing for us. Know when it's time to begin to retire some of the things that aren't working for you in favor of things that you stand to do a little bit better by. And having a sense of that specific life cycle. And so we'll move on to compliance. And so where compliance is concerned, there's no shortage of mandatory requirements, and rising to that challenge isn't particularly easy. Now, however, motivated cyber adversaries are not intimidated by an RMF authorization. And so compliance is a waypoint, but it shouldn't be your ultimate destination insofar as the goal of your cybersecurity program. The Federal Information Security Modernization Act, the Risk Management Framework, Assessment and Authorization, and Information Security Continuous Monitoring. These are tools that help you on your way. They satisfy your regulatory reporting and disclosure requirements. And if you're doing well, and we talked about being directionally correct, you stand to, you need to participate in, but you can be a leader in some of the different federal cybersecurity initiatives and be recognized for being a leader and recognizing those gains and sharing that what you've learned and being able to draw from the lessons learned by others. And so there's a burden to always have governance in place and risk management in place. And there's an adversarial element to this where there's a climate, whether geopolitical events, things in the industry are going to put your infrastructure, your data, the things you're charged with protecting at a higher risk at sometimes as opposed to other. So knowing and taking a measure of those differences and being able to sense those types of differences is really quite important. And so a type authorization that assumes a specific type of adversary and a specific climate is useful to a point, but only to a point. And so there needs to be a certain amount of flexibility built in for a climate where your infrastructure is at a higher elevated risk, certainly within specification of an RMF authorization, but there could come a time where a specific adversary with a specific set of capabilities is targeting you, and knowing whether or not you're susceptible is very important. And so compliance is a good waypoint, but hopefully not your ultimate destination. And so that leads us to being able to have situational awareness in the cyber domain. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework version 1.1 is a particularly good one. It's prescribed by executive order, of course, but there are 5 specific phases that we'll talk about in a second. But the goal of the framework itself is to there's an element of fostering good communications, both within internal and external organizational stakeholders. It helps you determine the activities that are most important to assure critical operations and service delivery. So not all of your different activities are going to be as important as the other, especially when you're being placed under different stresses. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but there's always an eye towards prioritizing your investments and maximizing the impact of each dollar spent on cybersecurity. And so if you know how much you're relying on a specific capability at rest or under stress, those are going to be really important. You're going to want to think about those a little bit more than ones that are utilized or you have less of a critical dependency upon. The framework itself is very useful in that where you go and you begin with the identify phase, which follows it with to protect and then detect and with respond and then ultimately recovery. Identify and protect are requirements and things that you can do during regular working hours, where identify is you take stock of you inventory what it is your mission is, what you're supposed to do, how you think you're going to go about doing it, and the makings of laying down your program. You get a good sense of what you're charged with and how you think you're going to go about attempting to defend it. Where you go into protect is you start building and rounding out your programs to meet the goals you've set for yourself and identify. These 2 phases lend themselves to core hours insofar as you're able to better and most reasonably plan for and to execute the work associated with these 2 phases at a time of your choosing. You move on to the detect phase. That's where you begin executing the different programs set up under Protect. And that tends to have a 24/7 by 365 way about it. So you're operating your capabilities, your workforce is at and on the job. The architecture and the programs that you have built and authorized are operating under nominal circumstances. The more and the better job you do with identify and protect, The less often we have found you find yourselves performing respond actions. And respond actions are when something hasn't gone quite right. It's not at a time of your choosing, typically. It is often at the time of the adversary's choosing. And when you're doing that, it becomes a very level of effort type of endeavor. And so you respond until the threat has been mitigated and you're able to begin and then complete recovery. Recover is ideally something that's practiced and part of a routine configuration management build and process. But still in all, it's a function of how well your identify and protect services were done, leading to better detection capabilities, ideally resulting in fewer respond activities, correlating and still yet fewer recover activities. And so you're best able to plan from a financial standpoint for those tasks associated with identify and protect, to a certain extent detect. But the adversary has a say in how well and how much you're going to spend on respond and then recover. And so we invite and encourage you to work very hard and diligently with those initial phases. I'd like to take a second to talk about another technique, another resource that we find particularly useful, and that's the MITRE ATT&CK framework. This is an inventory of the things an adversary must do and keep to gain and then maintain a persistent presence on your network. There are a specific, discrete set of different techniques or things that an adversary must do to get in and stay in. And you have, as a defender, you have opportunities to make investments, targeted investments, in order to deny the adversary those opportunities. And the framework allows you to map that out from end to end, and you get to plan where your investments are to be made. And so there's a framework associated with it. So I invite your attention to the diagram at the bottom right-hand corner. And to begin with, we're going to assess your defensive coverage. And so this is a function of you take your architecture and the systems you're defending as they are, and you're going to hold them up against this framework and see how many of the different adversarial techniques you've accounted for and how many you're susceptible to based on your current investments in your workforce, your policies, and your architecture. You can make certain assumptions about specific adversaries or what specific stresses or threats you expect to come under. And you can hold your situation, your particulars of this framework up against those adversaries and those threats to see how well you do. And areas with little coverage should stand out. Areas with perhaps overlapping coverage, where some rationalization may present, rationalization opportunities may present themselves, may be revealed. But you ought to be able to prioritize where your secondary efforts, where your adjustments might be best made based on where your strengths have been revealed to be and where your weaknesses or gaps have been identified. This gives you an opportunity to tune or acquire these new defenses. And once you've gone through that level of adjustment and investment, you can see whether or not the adjustments that you have made met the intention and closed the gaps that you've assessed as having by applying what we call adversary emulation. And so the MITRE ATT&CK framework is extremely useful, not only in assessing what and how effective your defenses ought to be. It helps you identify whether or not you've allocated sufficient coverage in very specific areas. And then you test whether or not that your investments or your capabilities are performing as you thought they were by using adversary emulation. And you repeat as necessary until you reach an equilibrium that's consistent with your resource level and what your threat landscape is. So where we get to security controls and the validation of the effectiveness of them, we encourage you to relentlessly measure and improve upon the implementation of your security controls. You would ideally be producing performance data to measure the return on the investment of each of the capabilities that you've made. So we talked about the MITRE framework. This is making sure that your self-assessment in those framework before you apply adversarial cyber emulation were made soundly. But it's also a compliance requirement. And there are security technical implementation guides that dictate certain things that must be done under ideal circumstances. Security content automation protocol helps you make those determinations whether or not it was done correctly or not. Where you're building capabilities and networks of software. There's developmental testing security. You want to be mindful of penetration testing and vulnerability assessments. And there's a life cycle for identifying vulnerabilities before they're part of your production network, after they've joined, and all the way through to closeout. There's a specific discipline for software assurance, development security operations, or DevSecOps for software. Those are harder to do because of the varying nature of the different programming environments that are available to, there's a huge spectrum. And the skill sets involved to do application security testing, static code analysis, dynamic code analysis. These skill sets are finite. And so there needs to be specific investment made there, but these things are doable. And there's templates, and there are ways to build and mature those types of programs, but they have to be given the consideration they're due, especially relative to traditional host-based, server-based types of security endeavors. And so we talked about adversarial cyber emulation when we were discussing the MITRE attack framework. We actually have a specific implementation that we recommend, and we call it purple teaming. And by that, we mean structured use of cyber red team resources to measure the performance of what we'll call a blue team, which is the organizational cybersecurity program. So your cybersecurity workforce, credentialed such as it is, reports for duty on a nominal day, operating your security architecture, which is functioning nominally. And we put it under a very specific controlled stress. And so you can pick certain areas of the MITRE attack framework, certain areas that an adversary must and has to do to gain and maintain that presence, and see if the security controls that you have implemented to deny the adversary those techniques are performing as you expected. And not only are they performing as you expected, are you getting the same results from your workforce as you go from mids to swings, as you go from one part of your architecture to another part of the architecture, from on-prem to in the cloud. These are very structured, deliberate measures that we take, and it is designed very specifically to measure the performance of the workforce, the documentation and the processes by which they operate and which your training is based upon, but also your infrastructure and the architecture that underpins it. This is how you know whether or not your program is performing as expected. If you don't apply something like a purple team to take these different measures during a time of your choosing, you run the risk of an adversary teaching you these lessons at a time that is not of your choosing. And so we encourage the purple team methodology as a matter of course. So with the drive to move into cloud-based implementations and realize the benefits and cost savings associated with doing so, we like to remind our partners that it's important to maintain shared situational awareness and continue to be able to normalize cloud-based and on-premises data types into a common analytical framework. And that's to say you need to be able to see in both places well enough to be able to perform that detect mission. And well enough is a relative term. It's not well defined, but and during purple teaming or related activities, you will begin to learn whether or not you've done it to a point where you feel you've raised the difficulty to unacceptable levels. And so if your analysts aren't able to sense as well as they can on premises as they do in the cloud, then you should be trying to gain that type of focus. And you need to be able to do it rapidly enough to deter an adversary. And so this is really tough. The log types and data source types introduced by cloud service providers, especially ones you're just getting to know, can be quite challenging. But that is something that should be considered in your cloud migration planning, and we encourage you to do so. Investments and capabilities that can't deter a motivated adversary should be evaluated for their utility, and we feel that the purple team concept helps to this end. There's this, and we talked about, when it comes time to retire something and bring a new capability to bear, a framework for establishing engineering, design, and selection of capabilities is necessary. And so an engineering process helps to this end. You want to be able to leverage a non-production but a realistic environment for testing in order to put these new capabilities, these candidates, through their paces to see whether or not they perform up to the needs of the organization. And that allows you to identify, evaluate, and then pilot potential new capabilities with a high enough degree of fidelity to know that your testing regime is going to work well enough in your production environment. Now, we'll move on to policy standards and training. The policy obviously sets the course for the organization and becomes the basis for the corresponding training program. So it's really important to make sure that your policy sets the backbone of the program is set. And so this takes you to strategic planning. What are you trying to get done? High level. You begin to apply a little bit more effort and rigor. You start developing your concept of operations. Then, describing what it is you're seeking to do. Maybe beginning to think about how you're going to go about doing it, who might be assigned organizationally. Eventually drilling down to standard operating procedures and desktop procedures where the specific keyboard strokes and mouse clicks associated with achieving the result are described, ultimately deriving from checklists and templates for things that are done often in a structured standpoint, and templates for deliverables that are routinely produced. And these, once they're written out, tend to form the basis of your training program. Once written down, somebody who joins your organization, months after these documents are written, they ought to be able to reference them and understand how to go about onboarding, how to go about doing their job and being successful in doing so. There's a knowledge management and decision support system that supports policy standards, but also the business back office. And so much like a network defender, you don't want to have your business analyst spending a lot of time manually seeking data that they need in order to do their analysis. Rather, instead, that data should find the business analysts as a matter of course. And so there's, much like a security incident and event management capability brings different log types to security analysts, your business analysts should have similar capabilities for the performance data that they need on the business end. And so we encourage those types of investments to be made. Not only do they help you meet federal and organizational requirements, but they have so many intangible benefits that help you more precisely control your organization. And we feel that those investments are particularly worthwhile too. Moving on to training and education, it's important that you give this specifically its due credit and due attention. Your workforce is always going to be your first line of defense. And so the end user and the privileged users, their awareness of not only the threats, but what's acceptable, what's not, where to go for help, how to go about getting that help is vitally important. You really don't want your workforce having to scratch around for what to do in an emergent situation. Instead, it's always best to have them prepared and educated and knowledgeable about what to do under a set of circumstances that wasn't anticipated and that requires requires help, where cybersecurity is necessary. Not only with the end users and the privileged users, but the administrators of your cybersecurity program. How do you understand and execute your risk management process? How do you know if you're doing the vulnerability management process in the way that your organization requires it done? Those folks need their training as well too. Similarly, there's other role-based IT security training that should be given its consideration. Again, with the workforce being your first line of defense, you need an efficient method by which those policies can be conveyed and then updated to the workforce. And that's going to take a couple different forms. We're all familiar with online forms of communication, especially of late, but there is a place for classroom and distance learning, and also conference-based modalities. And so there's a place for not only the curriculum, but also the ability to be able to successfully administer this content through different modalities to a varying degree of audiences. And we recommend putting time and energy into that because we have found that it pays dividends. Knowledge management decision support systems, I believe I mentioned a bit earlier. That takes me to the conclusion of this briefing. I thank you for your time and attention. Have a great day.